I have Dan Melo, zero books published author of the wonderful text here, Borderlines, The Edges of US Capitalism, Immigration, and Democracy. Of course, immigration, one of the big issues that a lot of us are discussing out there. And we hear a lot of different things. We read a lot of different headlines. Do we really know what's going on? Most of us probably not. But that's why we have Dan here to help us understand the issues a little bit better. So, Dan, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I will just caveat this with, in terms of knowing things, I may not help anyone understand anything because a third of the time immigration attorneys also don't understand what the hell's going on. So anyway, Dan Melo, been working as an immigration attorney for the last 5-ish years or so, been working with migrants for a bit longer than that. Son of a migrant myself, work in the nonprofit setting in the South right now, mostly with refugee clients. And got the gumption up to write this book a little bit about how I think capitalism influences all questions of immigration and democracy here in the U.S.
Awesome, and I found the book to be very interesting. It's actually it's not very long, so it's a quick read, but it's packed with information. Each of the chapters go through different sides of the question, talking about things like what is an immigrant, how imperialism plays a role, how imperialism comes back home, talking about ICE's role, the immigration courts. It's a really broad study here. I mean, what was it like to put all the work in to create something so full of information?
Yeah, it took over a year to actually finally write the thing. So I had actually pitched a different idea to Zero, and Doug Lane, who's the publisher there, came back and was like, not really my thing, but I see that you're an immigration attorney, pitch us something on that. So once I did, actually getting in the weeds then on some stuff that frankly that I didn't even know about the system until I got in there, was both shocking and saddening, but also enlightening. And so, yeah, it took about a year and a half to get it written, and then about as long to get it produced, which I think your last Zero Books guy mentioned, that it's like there's this massive amount of time to just actually get it into print. So it's been pretty wild.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, congratulations on finishing the book.
Thank you.
So I wanted to actually start the discussion today by talking about something relevant to the current moment. I think that'll make people stay a little bit. So I wanted to actually talk about what's going on in Afghanistan now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, your book, the cover shows somebody crossing the southern border of the United States, but we are currently experiencing the United States exit from Afghanistan. It's been a harrowing experience to watch it on TV, the images of people clinging to airplanes as they leave. But we're also starting to see this trend where some on the right wing are beginning to express increasingly bigger concerns about letting refugees into the country from Afghanistan. There's been comparisons to Angela Merkel, which is sort of the cardinal sin of on the right wing to let refugees into your country like Angela did. And I mean, some of the real extreme on the right wing will call it cultural genocide, even to let the refugees in. So I'm just kind of wondering, based on your read of how the U.S. immigration system works, how do you expect the United States as a society and as a government to handle the refugees of Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for starters, it's don't get me wrong, right? I always try to take a step back and say it's like there's a real humanitarian consequence to all of this going on right now. So what I'm about to talk in terms of political terms is like there are actually lives on the ground being destroyed as we speak. So I don't want to minimize that. But we're actually just witnessing in real time, right? Like how imperialism, and the consequences thereof drive migration, part of what drive migration patterns, right? Like it's literally happening in front of us. And I think maybe even you have pointed out, say on Twitter, I've seen a couple of times that it's like, this is, the exit that's happening right now is still not even as big as, say, the 2 million plus that have already been displaced from Afghanistan, right? Which is the second highest refugee population in the world. And I'm not just talking about estimates, right? Like there's over 2 million registered Afghani refugees with international refugee organizations registered right now. So that's actually a firm number, right? And there's obviously even more than that spread across the world at this point. And so in terms of like U.S. responsibility, something that I've been thinking about a lot is that, Ben Burgess just posted a piece in Jacobin about how, the U.S., given its ultimate imperial foot, in Afghanistan and all of the horrible things that have come from that, has a moral responsibility, right, to accept as many refugees as possible. We shouldn't be under any illusions that trying to maintain any kind of presence there was going to fix things. The Taliban also are just, for the most part, shitty people. Like, we shouldn't pretend like that's otherwise. But at the same time, right, like, realistically, in terms of the practical world, like the best thing that we can do as the U.S. right now for those people that, Biden stood up and claimed to care so much about, right, during his address, the whole humanitarian bit in that speech, is to admit as many people as want to come to the West. It just, it's just the moral obligation. And what's more, I think we actually have like a political obligation, right? In some ways, we've politically inserted ourselves into their lives in a way that I think they're entitled now to having a political stake in our country and having their political stake be part of ours.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting, the idea of us inserting ourselves into their political life, because that seems to be a big theme with the immigration crises that we experience on this side of the world. And, since Afghanistan, at least this week, this word nation building has become a very dirty word, right? And so I'm kind of wondering, because the Biden administration is currently trying to put money into nation building efforts in Central America, in Guatemala and El Salvador. And the justification is always, we're trying to fix the problem there because we'd rather they not have a reason to leave than we have to deal with them at the border. And I just kind of wonder, do you think that that nation building is something we should be engaging in at all on this level? And don't we just cause more problems when we do these things than we help?
Right. By and large, yes. Right. Like, I mean, Afghanistan is sadly a really good case study in this, is that you can spend 20 years and upwards of $1 trillion and have the whole thing fold on you in a week. Like, I mean, realistically, in like 48 hours, right? Like, so, for starters, yes. But then if you take a step even further back, though, and think about like the material question underneath that, like, why would somewhere like the U.S. even bother trying to do any kind of intervention in Central America, even if it is, quote, to end corruption and, fix some of the problems down there? It's like, well, it's because increasingly the human pressure coming from the South, has become to the point where it's like, we just don't know how to navigate it anymore. Like, it's building and building and building and building. And to some degree, right, it's not because Biden or Harris or any of the Democrats, deeply care about all of those human beings. Because if they did, right, there's a number of other steps that we could have already taken to protect those lives that are still, many of which are still sitting outside of the border as we speak, right? So it's like, I don't think that it's grounded in a humanitarian concern. I think it really is, ultimately a question of like having to navigate migration flows in this particular moment, which has always been true throughout U.S. history in terms of how we manage migration, right? It has everything to do with capital and labor and, questions of making sure that we protect power in a particular space. And so in the instance of Central America's, right, it's to me, it's a joke, right? It's at best, the idea, I think, is probably to see if we can build up enough state power there that they will take care of the problem for us, essentially, right? For the U.S., right? That will, in the same way that they sort of con Mexico into blocking migrants from moving through Mexico on their way to the U.S., right? Like, if we can just build up enough power to keep those humans inside inside their own territorial borders, then we don't have to deal with it. So that's a small price to pay, financially at least.
Yeah, that's interesting when you mentioned earlier about 2 million displaced Afghans and then the sudden upsurge of caring at the very end of the 20-year war, right? For the people who helped us in the war. I was actually reading, I showed you the Reagan immigration book that I was reading.
Yeah.
And one of the things I learned about from that book that really shocked me was that around the time that George Bush was running to replace Ronald Reagan, the Iran-Contra affair had happened. It caused the Contra, which was the right-wing regime that we were supporting, that was using death squads to fight against anything from a student protest to a labor strike, with extreme violence and so many innocent people getting caught in the way, and all funded by billions and billions of American dollars. When the Contras fell, there was a refugee crisis of our allies coming toward the United States. And at that point, Attorney General Edwin Meese decided to change the rules for Nicaraguans so that those Contra could come through. Even though there were all these people escaping the Contra for years, trying to get in, and they were just ending up in immigration prisons. They would do these kangaroo courts, and then they would send them back to Nicaragua or Guatemala or El Salvador. And the reason this author posed is that because George Bush was running for president, there was this pressure of like, hey, you can't leave our allies behind. And so they didn't want him to look bad, so they were going to help the allies. And so they helped, the Contra to get across. Yeah.
War criminals, essentially.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But I want to get to capitalism now, because I think that a lot of people who look at the situation at the border, who watch the stories of immigration on the news, they have some sense of people want to come here because they're hungry. People want to come here because maybe they get that they're escaping something. They see immigration maybe purely in terms of legalities, who's coming in legally, who's coming in illegally, are they bringing crime? I'm sorry to sound like Donald Trump now, but that's the speech, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And even just competitions over jobs and things like that come up a lot with immigrants. But I think, a lot of people, you would say, well, capitalism has a role in it, and they'd go, huh? Well, I don't, you'd have to explain that one to me. So could you explain kind of how capitalism in particular plays a role in this story?
Yeah, and I'll try to do as best a job as I can in my limited academic ability to make it not too woven to like cross woven. But for starters, right, it's like I think that as if I won't go so far as to call myself a Marxist because I don't read enough Marx, but like a fledgling leftist, right, that it's like we have to start looking at the underlying conditions, right? And so I try to open the book with this question of like, a lot of us start with all of those things and think, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And I actually think that the better question is what, right? What is the force that's driving these kinds of trends, changes, how it affects human lives? So in the instance of capitalism and immigration, right, literally from day one in this nation, and it hasn't developed this way universally, but specifically in the United States, right, from day one, the question of labor has always been central to how we navigate our laws, right? And that, expands ultimately into bigger questions of citizenship that we can get to in a minute. But from the earliest days, right, like even pre-independence, the first migrants to the country, apart from slaves, were indentured servants. And that trade, ultimately, literal trade of people, had to be regulated in some way. And so you had actually initially the colonies, setting out certain rules and laws for how that was going to get navigated. And this became a tension point, actually, within the legal system, right, of again, controlling labor as between the colonies, eventually the states, and then actually became oppositional to slavery, right? It's like, so people who were indentured servants were legally considered articles of commerce in the same way that slaves were considered articles of commerce. And this was the legal fiction that we created in order to be able to say, we have control over your body, essentially. We can decide whether or not you stay. You're an article of commerce in transport, right? Coming into the country.
Right.
And so at that point, right, we kind of started to, racialized stuff had, of course, grown out of, at that point, together with sort of the flourishing of early capitalism in America. And so there had to be a split and say, okay, we can't have this think of it anyway in this way anymore, strictly in terms of articles of commerce, because white people, indentured servants, don't want to be seen as the same as enslaved Black and brown people. So we have this split attention that actually doesn't end up getting resolved in the Supreme Court. There's a whole bunch of really old, boring cases that go back and forth on this issue from that period. But what ends up happening then is that this all, the question of migration, because we need, the federal government ultimately needed to be able to settle these things between the states and decide who was going to be able to do, set out what kind of laws and who was responsible for these people when they came in. Ultimately, all of that just gets rolled up into being part of the state's power to govern as a sovereign, right? As a collective power over everyone. And it's never gone back from that since. And so with that in mind, then, as you march forward in time, whether you're looking at just the very earliest laws of, post-independence that give the president mostly unilateral ability to throw people out of the country, or, subsequent things like the Bracero program in the 1940s, which, prior to that, of course, there was a great deal of abuse of largely Mexican labor. But, World War II hits, and all of a sudden we literally don't have enough physical capacity to fund our war machine, the whole machinery of war here. So they open up what ends up being called the Bracero program to allow many, many, many Mexican migrants into the country under a temporary-ish legal status in order to fill in those spots, right? But of course, the minute, and this is where this gets, as this tale gets spun, it gets more and more complicated. It's like the minute that the war is over, even as the U.S. is like jumping up and down and celebrating, the victory of democracy over the Axis powers and this new universal moment, you have them shutting down and deporting millions of braceros, putting them in jails. And I should note they even use the chain link fence that was used around the Japanese internment to start building the first big border wall across Mexico, right? And so again, there's all sorts of other like small examples, and we can jump, to modernity, to right now, where we're looking at how migrants, because of their status, right, and it's this self-perpetuating cycle, because of their status, are pushed into low-wage but necessary labor jobs. Agriculture right now, at the time of writing, it wasn't as big, but right now it's huge, right? Like in-home services for medical care and that kind of stuff are big migrant things. And, while the cost would be tremendous and the humane cost would be tremendous as well, the truth is that like the U.S. could, in a way, basically start forcibly removing people en masse if they wanted to. It would be very, very expensive, right? But there's no need to in that sense, because the legal, having a person be documented versus not is all the power really that you don't want to, you don't have to, right? And so that extends even to other like types of lawful status, say in the H-1B industry, which is all things, skilled labor business. Tech companies are big into bringing people from abroad, right? You have tech companies exploiting the H-1B visa by setting, really actually pretty low wages. And I have numbers in the book if you're interested in such things, but like setting really low wages for these folks in order to get, maximize profit, right? We got to get the most we possibly can. And keeping wages low is a great way to do that. and there's plenty of bodies that are able to fill those spots. But of course, the minute, that they're done with those, they actually don't have any legal responsibility to sponsor those folks to stay. And so a lot of them go back, or just sent back because that's just the end of your time. So, to make a long story very, very short, right, it's ultimately a question of how cheap labor, as part of just the idea of capital itself, right, if you're extracting that surplus value from people, if part of what creates capital itself is the capitalist getting to keep part of your labor, well, the lower the wage are, the lower you have to pay people, worry about things like housing, medical, all that stuff, right? As an employer, as a capitalist, then that's just more money in your pocket, right? And so, if you follow that weave throughout American history, you're going to consistently find that while not the sole explainer in terms of just pure money making, because again, questions like racism, other political considerations at time do deviate. Even you mentioned just now, sort of about Bush, right? That it's like, but that's why it's called a political economy, right? Is that one helps drive the other, they bounce back and forth.
Yeah, and there was a lot of in some of the passages I read from the book, there was a lot of parallels I saw. Well, at first I saw them as parallels to slavery and to fugitive slaves and that sort of system. Now, the way that you explain it, I see it as more of just a much larger story about exploitation and movement of bodies into the continent to produce value. And it's almost, it's like, I'm almost picturing Pinocchio, the Pleasure Island, just all of these people getting shoved into the machine,
Exactly.
Especially this, you told one of the stories in the book about the young man who was born in the United States but didn't have citizenship papers, or was born in Mexico but was American, should have been a naturalized citizen constitutionally, and then had all of these problems because he's Hispanic, and so he looks like he should be an immigrant, and because he doesn't there's he's like on the edges, to use the term that you use in your book, of what a citizen is. And it just reminded me of how in the stories of Black people being kidnapped during slavery and mistakenly believed to be a fugitive slave and thrown into slavery that way, so I saw a lot of parallels like that.
Yeah, and something I tried to do in the book, I don't know how well I did, but I tried to do in the book is talk about this, like, there are, sadly, right, all of these kind of parallels. And I think actually one of the scholars that I did a bunch of reading from, discussing like the indentured servitude slave part, was like, is that the concept of an immigrant in America was born in part in the shadow of slaves, right? It was sort of, again, it's like you can't entirely remove those things. And so in a sense, like, you are right, it's both parallel and intersecting in that way, is that it's like, it's not that it's the same, but there are sadly remarkably similar things between how this same displaced group of people, this pool of cheap labor, we're actually seeing in our own citizenry, right? Like, the whole rise of the gig economy is what Marx, I would argue, what Marx would term today like that reserve army of labor, right?
Yes.
Like, you have to have this big pool of people who are not settled in their jobs, not in their work, because that has a great, wage suppressing effect. But what's more, it's like any time that you start, it provides solutions for capitalists, all kinds of problems, right? If you start to protest, I've got plenty more bodies that I can pull in here. I don't need you, right? So, that it's like, we see this group of large pool of undocumented people in the country as part of that reserve army of labor, but it's really not that far removed from a citizen near you, right? Your Uber driver, your DoorDash, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of inner empire. That's something that I think some of the viewers won't be familiar with. So we talk. The book talks a lot about imperialism, and we talk a lot about imperialism here on this channel. And we usually talk about it as something that's being projected outward into the world. if we're critical of imperialism, we know the effects of our imperialism out there, and we see it as some distant foreign sort of thing. We don't necessarily think about the effects of imperialism on our own country. One of the things that kind of made me conscious of that at first was actually Gore Vidal, in the way that the way that he describes wars. It's always the effect of the war on the homeland. It's always about the heightened paranoia in the population. It's about people turning against each other. It's about heightened surveillance laws, people going to jail for speaking out against the country, internment camps in World War I, German internment camps, Japanese internment camps in World War II. And also during World War I, you have race riots and strikes all over the country going on. And the country really was torn apart. And the World War I, has to be said, in America's case, was really an imperialist fueled adventure. And so can you talk a little bit about what it means today for our imperialism to be affecting us at home? What are we losing because of imperialism?
Yeah. So specifically in the case of Latin America, author Greg Grandin, who I draw some of his material on in the book, and I do recommend if people want a big read on some of that stuff, he talks about like how the U.S. really honed its whole imperial acts in Latin America during, mid 19th century through, about Reagan's time, right before we finally started to back out of affairs the way we had been. But all that said, right, that it's like you already mentioned, right, that it's like we see things like internment coming home to roost literally within our borders. There are things that were developed, say, during a lot of those secret campaigns or proxy wars in Latin America, disinformation, propaganda, all that stuff. They actually, again, literally sort of honed those tactics and then started to turn them on dissenters here in the U.S. There's even an example, I think it's from, I want to say it's the 50s, 60s, where literal government or CIA-backed squads were like harassing or even threatening like labor organizers in California. There's a host of examples, but to jump to more recent events, right? Like the militarization, and this is something that I sort of wrap that chapter up, is like the militarization of the police right now, the chance of, especially I think it was in Ferguson, right? The police saying, whose streets, our streets. There's, I pull from a gentleman who had served, I think, 2 rounds of service in Afghanistan, or maybe it was Iraq, who noted that it's like, man, this sounds really familiar. And it's because that is how we viewed our mission, our presence in the streets of Baghdad, right? So it was Iraq. These are our streets. These no-knock procedures that have become increasingly common and cost people their lives here in the U.S. A lot of those were, developed and perfected in a military setting first, right? And so if you start to look for them, sadly, it's like there are a lot of not just parallels, but literal things that have bounced off, the outside and made their way back into everyday life that we already sort of don't even think about or take for granted, right? But again, just to use those strong examples, like if you just look at the police and how police response has escalated and where they get their stuff from and their tactics from, it's because it's been worked out elsewhere first.
Yeah, that was one of the stories when I was researching a little bit on Charlottesville that I didn't see a lot of people mention, that a week after Charlottesville, Trump lowered all the restrictions on Afghanistan-grade weaponry and lowered all these Obama-era restrictions on the police. Charlottesville was considered a bad day for Trump and his presidency, but he got this big win, this big concession out of it. It's fascinating. And that it's probably a good time to segue into Trump, actually, because I have a question about him. Because, when Trump was elected president, I mean, obviously his run for president was charged with anti-immigrant rhetoric, calling people who are crossing over the border from Mexico, describing them as kind of a gaggle of rapists and drug dealers and criminals. It charged up a resistance to Trump that really took form, especially in the early months and the first year of the Trump administration, where we saw Cory Booker at the airport with the megaphone saying no travel ban, and we saw AOC at the camp looking through the fence. We're not sure what she was looking at, but that's the picture. And we had this energy that Trump was posing this unique threat that was going to be like a Hitlerian level threat on immigrants. But over time, that kind of wore down as people started to look more at how all the presidents had dealt with immigrants, and that there was actually a larger problem with the policy itself, that even someone like Trump couldn't really, somebody being replaced by Trump would not fix those problems. So I'm kind of wondering, and that's given birth to this sort of other view where people are saying, well, I'd rather have a president who says xenophobic things, but isn't as bad on immigration as Obama. So I wonder, what's the right way to think about this? I mean, first of all, is Trump uniquely bad among presidents on immigration? And does rhetoric matter as much if the president's saying nasty things or nice things? Or is it really down to the policy that we should care about?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to discount rhetoric just because I think obviously like that probably has had consequences outside of just immediate immigration to the country. But that being said, right, like man, he's just he's a horrible human being. Like I don't think I need to say that out loud, but he's a horrible human being. Right? Nevertheless, right, like he is not alone in his treatment of people. And something that I really try to grill them on at the end of the book is right that it's like I'm not saying it's worse, but it's certainly pernicious, right? That Democrats have long posited themselves as friends of migrants, right? The progressives are friends of migrants and have enacted some of the worst, most vile, pieces of immigration legislation. Bill Clinton, enacting the Illegal Immigration Reform Act, for example, that has done more harm to migrants than many of the other presidents, Democrat or Republican, right? Obama, ultimately deported more people than the sum total of, I think it was the 20th century presidents combined, right? I mean, it's just some absurd number. But at the same time, literally at the same time, right, is bringing in, kind of crypto pseudo relief in the form of DACA, pushing DAPA. And so it's like I was talking with the guys on This Is Revolution, about how it's like you have this, on the one hand, the numbers literally don't lie, right? Like we were deporting people in with such efficiency in a way that we had never done under a Democratic president, under a person of color, Democratic president. Like it's like that didn't inherently fix things either, right? That he would hopefully have a level of solidarity with that population. Didn't matter, right? The system is the system. But all that to say, right, that it's like, while those things seem contradictory, it's ultimately, again, if you just peel the layer back far enough, it's like, if politically it makes sense to get both, why not have both, right? So it's like if you can give a little bit with the one hand and take a hell of a lot more with the other, and people will celebrate you for it, why not, right? And so in Trump's case, right, I'm not saying that he wasn't terrible, because he did do a lot of really nasty things, the asylum system, something I opened the book with, right, that we've actually had reversed under the current president of the asylum system has went, the already pretty frail system went down a hole really fast, right? Like it got pretty bad there for a while. So it's not to say that he didn't also do some pretty awful things, but what frustrates me now, especially now in the current moment, right, is that I've heard a whole lot of like sighs of relief, not just from the populace, but even from practitioners of like, oh, thank God Biden's in office, right? And it's like, so far, the only thing he's managed to do is put things back to where they were under Obama, which was not good in the first place, right? He's still on track, to ramp up deportations. He's using Title 42, which was under, something that Trump started to cast out families. All that to say, it's like in some ways the Democrats have consistently benefited from figures like Trump because they get to be like, hey, look, we saved you guys from this evil man, when in reality it's just like put a nicer coat of paint on a really ugly system.
Yeah. It's interesting. I saw an article today. It's kind of old, but I'll show you actually. It says Biden set to accept fewest refugees of any modern president, including Trump, report says. I was shocked by that.
Yeah. And I guess I don't need to be fair to Biden, but it's like, of course, the pandemic did slow that whole process down. Nevertheless, right, like he took, I think it was earlier this year, maybe in March, like was going to leave the cap at, whatever the horrifying historic low of like 15,000 or something that it was at. And it was only through just like, a great deal of political pressure that he even raised that number, right? But yeah, he will be it's not even on track anymore. He just will be not on track. He will be the president to have resettled the fewest refugees in a fiscal year. Yeah.
Do you think Bernie would have been significantly different?
This was something else that's come up a little bit recently, and while I think that Bernie probably would have tried, this is part of the nature of the asylum system, is that or not just the asylum system, but the immigration system writ large, right? Is that like you cannot ultimately undo all of the harms that capitalism perpetuates on this end, like on an executive end of things. But I do think that, he would have been at least more pliable to political pressure to do things like expand the kinds of protections that we had for asylum. I tentatively would have hoped at least, I suspect he would have pulled out, for example, of Afghanistan as well, but maybe had a little bit better plan for resettling people before doing that. Tough to say, though.
Yeah. Yeah, it is tough to say. But you do, in the case of Biden, you do kind of have a long history there that you can draw on because he's been in government. I mean, I guess Bernie's been in government too. Maybe he's gotten a pass. I don't know. I haven't really looked into his immigration record. He's also the senator from Vermont. I guess Biden's the senator from Delaware. Well, yeah, it's tough to say.
Yeah.
But wow, that is incredibly interesting. So, I mean, I don't want to put this last question sort of on your shoulders to sort of say, okay, what, like, this question is called "Что делать," which is Russian for "what is to be done," and it's the name of the Lenin text, "What is to be done," which every time people say, "Oh, I read What Is to Be Done," I always try to joke and go, "Oh, the Chernyshevsky book." It's a really stupid joke. They're like, "No, the Lenin book." So he based the name of the book on this book by Chernyshevsky called.
Okay, I didn't know that. Piece of trivia. That's funny though.
Yeah. It was like a book about a guy. It was actually a book about cuckolding. And Lenin thought it was a funny and interesting book. It was kind of crudely written. The proletariat loved it, so I guess that was his way of reaching out. Like, I don't want to put the whole thing on your shoulders, but we've looked here at, we've got a long history of exploitation of bodies being trafficked across the country, across the borders. The borders themselves are essentially a socially constructed fiction that serves the interests of the capitalist class, and the laws are specifically bent towards what makes it most easy for that class to traffic human bodies. So, do we go out and protest? Do we write our congressman? Like, what do we do?
Yeah.
What can be done to fight against this?
That is the question, right? And I think, like, obviously I can't resolve like the whole incrementalism versus revolution debate. I've always been kind of hate to be the centrist here, but like kind of a both and sort of thing. Like, we can talk all day about revolution and just like upending the whole system and, eliminating borders and eliminating the distinctions between people. But at the same time, right, like, okay, well, but there are literally people being thrown back out of the country to their deaths, right? What do we do for those folks in the meantime? And so for me, it's always been, as much as we can, juggling those things as much as we can, doing both at the same time. Obviously, like right now in this particular moment, I think political pressure to resettle, we should seize on that to resettle as many Afghans as we can. I think I've tried to make the case at least that both morally and politically we have a responsibility to do so. And I think there is a moment here to try to push that. But that being said, right, like that's not going to solve any of those problems going forward, right? There's still millions upon millions of displaced people through climate, through other wars, other imperialist actions, just through the swing of global capital throughout the world, right? So for me, it's sort of like what I tried to envision at the end is sort of this notion that it's like we have to think about building internationalism of solidarity across borders as against the system, right? And there's sort of a paradox therein that it's like it's very hard to organize migrants because of the gaps in legal status, but at the same time, it's also very hard to tackle the question of legal status without more political power. And so in that struggle, I guess it's for me, it's been a question of, okay, can we get enough footholds in the legal system, fighting those fights about who's included, who's excluded? Can we do those things while also starting to build up some level of solidarity across nations? Because I don't, I think Russia's the example, right? That it's like, I don't think we're going to get global socialism in one country, right? Like it's just not going to translate. Like we're going to have to figure out a way to move past that. And one thing that, I say at the end is also just that it's like the concept, like thinking about borders being completely open isn't actually all that hard, right? It's actually the much harder question is what comes after that, right? What does a world look like where nation states are not the ones dictating the who the we is, who the in and the out is, for the interest of capital, right? And in that sense, and actually, I think Dr. Bajalan pointed this out in the chat while I was on This Is Revolution, that it's like, in that sense, we have to overcome capitalism because the nation state is the foundational, sort of building block for making sure that capitalism continues. And that's not to fetishize the state, and it's also not an anarchist position of like, well, we just need to get rid of the state and then everything will be better, right? But rather, can we develop a political project and a movement that is grounded in sort of just mutually justifiable principles across what once were borders and structures in a way that is not going to dehumanize people this way. So yes and yes.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for coming on the chat today, Dan.
Sure.
Thanks so much for sharing what you've been researching. And if you really want to go deep on what Dan was talking about today, once again, the name of the book is Borderlines, The Edges of US Capitalism, Immigration and Democracy. It's out now from Zero Books. Came out in 2020, is that right?
It came out in August of this year, actually.
Oh, this year? You mean it just came out?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, I recommend everybody get it. And if you look in the description below this video, you will see a link to where you can get your copy of Borderlines by Dan Melo. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time here on Queer POTUS.